Rabbi Sai, good morning. Today is Zayin Elul. It's 7 days into Elul. Last week Friday was Aleph. Today Thursday is Zayin. This happens always. Now, how do I introduce this? We're in the middle of a letter. We're right in the middle of a letter, written to a chassid who was a Talmid Chacham, Rabbi Abramson. Okay, ich will machen sein Asadi, but I'm going to talk in generalities first. Forgive me. I need Mashiach. No, I'm fine. I just where are you sweating? I want to give you a cloud. If you ever studied the Rebbe's Igros Kodesh, the early Igros, in the later years, the Rebbe doesn't really have the time for it. It seems that the Rebbe had a desire to write about certain things. Now, I'm not sure if the word is the Rebbe had a desire to write about certain things, or the Rebbe had a desire to write about everything. He just needed a pretense. But if you look at the Igros from the Rebbe before he was Rebbe, in the America years, and the first few years after he was Rebbe, when in quotes, either the Rebbe had more time, or he still carried this burden, the Rebbe would find excuses to write letters to people without the people fully understanding why he's writing it to them. I'm going to give you what is to be my best example of this. And I've talked about this before. There was a Yid whose name was Harav Avram Hecht, one of the 6 Hecht brothers, of Avram Hecht. He was a Rav of a Kehillah Sfardim, of Syrian Jews for a very, very, very long time. Maybe 50 years, close to 50 years, 40, maybe. He was the head of Igros Rabbonim. And there's a handful of letters, between half a dozen and a dozen letters, where the Rebbe addresses him as Harav Hagon. Harav Hagon, upon him he can't lend in that. He was one of the Rebbe's Talmidim, he was one of the Rebbe's boys. He was Rabbi Yankel Hecht's older brother. The Rebbe needs to give him cover. He would ask the Rebbe questions, mostly in the realm of Kabbalah, and the Rebbe would answer him. Apparently he dabbled in Kabbalah, but the answers that the Rebbe gives him are, to put it in words, Shalei Lef Yarech HaKasha. He asks a small question and he gets a gigantic answer. I spoke to one of his son-in-laws, and his son-in-law said to me, "What, the Rebbe was writing to my shver, the Rebbe was writing to my father-in-law. The Rebbe wanted to write about this, my father-in-law made a mention, so he became the excuse." And I'm not saying that Rabbi Avram Hecht wasn't a keli for what the Rebbe wrote to him, but I don't know what he asked, because you don't see the questions, but the Rebbe's answers are not just answering questions, they're presenting ideas. I'll give you another example. There was a Yid named Tzvi Hirsch Fogelman, Rabbi Fogelman from Worcester. He asked the Rebbe a letter in Tafshin Ches in 1948 about the Gimel Midas HaRachman, and the Rebbe gave him a masterpiece of an answer, a classic answer about the Gimel Midas HaRachman. And he made a book, Kedushah Torah, that he published himself about his own life and so on. He put that letter in there. The letter was written to him. Here's another example. of a letter written to a younger man, and I'm sure I can a bit of lending, but it's, to me at least, very obvious that the Rebbe wasn't answering a question. The Rebbe was putting to paper a subject that he felt needed to be presented in a comprehensive way. And of course the rule is, the Rebbe took topics in Torah that nobody but him could do. You understand? Very obscure. There is an unbelievable letter from the Rebbe written to Rabbi Rifkin about Hashgacha Pratis. Rabbi Rifkin, Harav Rifkin, the Rosh Yeshiva. It's so amazing. There must be 50 sources, 50 Manim Akamis in that letter alone, maybe more. Harav Rifkin asked the Rebbe a letter. The Rebbe wrote him a long answer before he was the Rebbe. And it's so obvious that the Rebbe wasn't writing to Harav Rifkin. He wanted to bring this idea forward. So he collected the Rebbe's mind from Kol HaTorah Kula, and he presents it in a systematic way. Mashiach, Tchias HaMesim, Olam Haba, these are topics that the Rebbe wrote about at length. People asked him questions. He could have answered the question in 3 lines, and he chose to answer the question in 5 pages, because he was writing for posterity. The Rebbe was writing for the world. And a lot of those letters we're first finding now. Letters on topics in Torah. It seems to me that this is a similar thing. Harav Ebris was a Talmid Chacham. He learned on the Lubavitcher. He can't learn it. And the Rebbe is writing to him about a Yom of Askonis, right? It's not about... The letter that he wrote to the Rebbe was not about Limud HaTorah. The letter that he wrote to the Rebbe was practical questions about the yeshiva in Melbourne and about name to use and all these kinds of things. But the Rebbe uses this excuse, this opportunity, as a medium for connecting a practical question to an Indian in Torah. And there's no question that the Rebbe is giving him as it's a gift, you know. You see this a lot. People write the Rebbe letters by the Friedrich Rebbe. It's an unbelievable fanem. People write the Friedrich Rebbe letters, and in the answer, he gives them a matona, a story, a word. And by the Rebbe, it's Torah. You know, the Friedrich Rebbe's gifts were Torah Shabal Peh. There were things that he heard that are not written in any sefer, and only he could give it over. And he gave it to a person. He wouldn't repeat. He would give every person different gifts. In other words, he found 101 excuses to give out what's called Vosarum Chasidus is, the periphery of Chasidus, the Shimusha Shel Torah, the stories and the Chasidische Werte that the Friedrich Rebbe gave us, that are now part of our literature. They're part of our definition as Chabad Hasidim and as Hasidus in general, in terms of defining ourselves. And the Friedrich Rebbe used to gift people. You asked him a question, he answered your question, and then Ravali told you a story. Did he need to tell the story? I'm sure he did, but he didn't need to tell it to you necessarily. You were the excuse, and the Rebbe does the same thing. So here is a discussion of building a yeshiva in Melbourne, Australia, in 1951, mind you, which was a chalem shechomu achedim al achedim. It was an impossible dream, but it was a dream that, if it had not been realized, would have resulted in a nightmare. I mean, if the Rebbe hadn't pushed the Anash, the Rebbe hadn't sent people and pushed the Anash. You know, the Rebbe's person in Australia was a Yid by the name of Rav Zalman Serebransky. There's no question about it. 5 or 6 mishpachas went to Australia after the Holocaust. There was Altois, and there was what's his name? Kluvgant, and there was Kaplun is a grandson of Rav Zalman Feiglin. He came to Australia in 1911. That's a whole nother madrega. Kaplun is a grandson. You read his book? You read his story? Oh, what a book. He writes about his grandfather. There was Serebransky, there was Vyshetsky's Shver, there were 5 or 6 mishpachas that went to Australia. Rabbi Pliskin, I'm forgetting all. Gorevich, Nochem Zalman Gorevich was sent. Rabbi Tzalel Volshansky eventually ended up there. Later on, the Mordechai Polov joined. There were a Nash that was sent to Australia. They were sent to Australia because they were able to go to Australia. A lot of them didn't have little children, or because there was opportunity for them for Australia, but they were sent to Australia to build Yiddishkeit, really. How they made a parnassa was very important, but it wasn't why they were sent. The person who was sent to Australia as the shliach of the Rebbe, I think, you could see this in Reb Zalman Serebransky. They had nothing. They had no people, they had no money, they had no connections, they had no nothing. And they built Moistus with Mesidas Nefesh. They built the yeshiva, and I've told you the story before, that 5 or 6 years later, Rabbi Kaplun Zayde When Moshe Zalman Feiglin came to this Rebbe, to our Rebbe, and the Rebbe was mechabed him, wow. The Rebbe gave him unbelievable kavod, and asked him to do him a favor, to do a shutfus, a partnership. What was the partnership? To build the girls' school. The boys' school that Rabbi Sarabratsky was carrying on his own, there was no way he could carry also a girls' school. So the Rebbe asked Moshe Zalman Feiglin to make this his. And he agreed. They made the girls' school. Eventually, all of the meisters became under one umbrella. But those schools were so small. You had one student in the school, 2 students in the school, 3 students. It wasn't a school. It was Mesiras Nefesh. But that Mesiras Nefesh allowed that later on these schools to become bigger and bigger. And now, today in Melbourne, how many communities are there? And how many meisters Teira v'Chinuch are there? In a das tachten way, the fact that 60, 70 years ago that Rabbeim started schools with 1 or 2 girls or boys is the reason those communities grew. Otherwise, the people who came there would have slowly drifted away, like happened to so many Yidden that came to Australia. Anyway, so the letter is a practical letter. The Rebbe starts talking Torah. Top of the page, Tov Tzadik, top of the page. Goydel ha'inyan shal yiseid v'ispatchos yeshiva al taras HaKedesh. The Rebbe says, we talked about building a yeshiva. Now let's talk the Torah of yeshiva. There's a Torah behind building a yeshiva. There's a whole lamdas by building a yeshiva. And the Rebbe says, what's the definition of a yeshiva? That it's built al taras HaKedesh. The literal translation of the words taras HaKedesh means the purity of holiness. The purity of holiness. Now, if you've ever studied Chassidus, and it's based really on the Zohar, and it's brought in other Sifrei Musar as well, Tahara is lower than Kiddush. Tahara is lower than Kiddush. What's the mashal for Tahara? Water, wine, or oil. You can have clean water and dirty water. When water is solul, when water is clear, it's called Tahir, you understand? What's the mashal for Kedusha? Fire or light. And of course, it says in Chazal, we had it recently someplace, Halekei dvarei ke'esh, divrei Torah, fire cannot become tummy, water can become tummy, oil can become tummy, wine can become tummy, fire, light cannot become tummy. So anything in Yiddishkeit which is comparable to Tara, to Mayim, could be Torah and it could be tummy. Anything which is comparable to Eish, to fire, like divrei Torah, ain't become tummy, they just can't become tummy. So Tara is a lower level and Kedusha is a higher level. Now there's indications from different Sfarim that in some contexts they consider Kedusha lower, Tara higher than Kedusha. I don't know how that works, but I get that impression from certain Sfarim that they consider Tara higher than Kedusha. This expression, Taharas HaKodesh, it should be Tara or Kedusha. Kedusha is higher than Tahara. Tahara means they should be clean and not dirty. Well, what's your problem? Let's not philosophize here. Let me do the talk. There's indications in some contexts that Tahara is higher than Kedusha. The words Tahara HaKodesh means there's something called Kedusha, and there's the Tahara of Kedusha. So you can read it in a number of different ways. Bottom line is, there's Yiddishkeit, and there's Yiddishkeit b'Kedusha b'Tahara. Now understand, let's be honest. We live in the so-called real world, that's what we call it. Yeah. We live in Golus. We live in Saves Mana Golus, because of the Mashiach. Which means that practically, to be an Erlich Yid, to be a truly frum Yid the way you're supposed to, is hard. It's very hard. With Baruch Hashem, we live now in a Kehillah, right? When Yidden came to America, it was very, very difficult. But now we have community support. That's what a community does. You live in Crown Heights, we all hate it because they control us and they judge us and they talk about us. But on the other hand, the community, for better or for worse, to a greater extent, to a lesser extent, is an incredibly great support system. It holds it. It's easier to be frum when you're around other people who are frum. It's easier to be Lubavitch when you're around other people in Lubavitch. Unfortunately, there's cracks. People slip through. People get lost. People get forgotten. I don't want to speak to Tzad HaShlila, but in Golos it's hard to serve Hashem on the highest levels. Chassidus is about Tahara. Chassidus is about being pure. And Chassidus is even about aspiring for Kedusha. These are high levels. And you know what the meaning of high levels is? They're very expensive. They cost. You know, the Rambam writes, if you want to be learning Torah in the highest madregas, you have to divorce other things. You can't have everything. There's a price. There's a sacrifice. If you want to be in a madrega of Keser Torah, whatever that means, you have to own the crown of the Torah. You have to give up other things. You can't have everything. So Taras HaKodesh is a challenge. It's a challenge. When the Rebbe creates chinuch, I've talked about this so many times in my learning and teaching here. When the Rebbe creates chinuch, he creates it with an akshanis, with a principle. I told you the story. It's a mind-blowing story that the joint was paying all the bills in Morocco, all the bills. And the Rebbe insisted that there should be schools with so many different rules that it was so inefficient, it was so unpretty. It really wasn't nice. It was pikuach nefesh, trying to save Jewish souls. And the joint wanted to have the school should look nice. There should be desks, and there should be tables, and there should be chairs, and there should be blackboards, there should be chalk. The children should come to school prepared to learn, and so on. And the way the schools were, kids came to school in pajamas and barefoot, because they were not really students, and the joint was disturbed by this. And the Rebbe was saying, you're a student, not student, a Yiddish kind, you have to save Jewish souls. So they had this conflict with John for years. They were paying the bills, and the Rebbe was giving them a hard time. So I think this is so funny. The last negotiation step that they took was they told you, Shem Matasov like this, we'll give you everything you want except one thing. You cannot take counsel from overseas. Advice from overseas. Because they knew there's no way in the world that Shlomo Matasov is this crazy. Someone is giving you every dollar you live on and you're arguing with him how to spend it. They knew only a Rebbe. This is the famous Yud Beis Tammuz Vart that we talked about this summer a number of times, that when the Frierdiker Rebbe turned 15, what did his father tell him? Azoy nishtandish. This way, you come to America. You have to save American Yiddishkeit. You're talking about millions of people. And you dafke establish a school with no Limudei Chol. It's crazy. Without any English. It's crazy. But that's called being a Rebbe. Being a person of principle. Now, the label attached to that is Chinuch al Taras HaKodesh. Now understand that when this letter was written, and even especially in the lifetime of the Frierdiker Rebbe, I'm going to tell you a story that I heard secondhand, I didn't hear it firsthand. One of Rabbi Zirkin, Olav Hashem, Lezer Zirkin's grandchildren, told me the story that he heard from his grandfather. Rabbi Eliezer Zirkin, Olav Hashem, was an incredibly great Yirei Shamayim. He was very God-fearing. He was very, very God-fearing. He learned on the Lubavitch. How old was he in 1949? He was in high school. He was in the Korean War, by the way. He was in Korea, and he refused to shave his beard. He fought with the Rebbe told him, you fought with the entire U.S. Army and you won. He had a full beard, he wouldn't touch his beard. And they tried to force him to shave. The Rebbe told him, Biz Mesiras Nefesh. He was in action. He was a real God-fearing man. Anyway, he learned that you're not supposed to learn the Limudei Chol. Learning secular subjects is awesome. Not allowed. Unless you need it for Parnasa, and he didn't need it for Parnasa. So he came to the yeshiva then, you're talking 48, 49, says, I want to go to English. They didn't have even an option about going to Limudei Chol. The school was set up a half of the Hebrew, half of the English. So the Hanhola went to the Frierdiker Rebbe. And the Frierdiker Rebbe called in this boy, who was 16, 17, I don't know how old he was. He was a teenager. And he told his grandchildren, I heard this secondhand. He said, you don't understand what it means, the Frierdiker Rebbe's eyes. Anybody who's experienced the Rebbe's eyes knows what force means. The Rebbe's eyes were a force. They were a physical force. They looked at you, they burnt a hole in you. He says the Frierdiker Rebbe's eyes were 100 times sharper. It was painful to look at him. I mean, his face was holy, it was glorious. But the eyes were fire. He was brought into the Frierdiker Rebbe, and the Frierdiker Rebbe had them oisgemuset. The Frierdiker Rebbe bawled him out. And he said, your desire to leave Limudei Chol is not L'Shem Shamayim, it's because you're lazy to learn. Imagine. The Frierdiker Rebbe, it seemed, wanted him to learn Limudei Chol. The Frierdiker Rebbe bawled him out for wanting to leave English. He says, you have no idea how painful it was. A Rebbe should call you in, and what am I doing? I'm eating treif. The end of the story was the Frierdiker Rebbe gave him a chelik. Afterwards, the yeshiva called him and said that the Rebbe said that he doesn't have to go to Limudei Chol. And he would sit in Beis Medrash in the afternoon. This is in high school. What's the pshat? What's the why? First he bawled him out and then he gave him what he asked for. I could understand that also. It's like, it says in Chassidus, the Rebbe Sichas. Moshe Rabbeinu broke the luchas and then we became kalim for more Torah, the Rebbe says in the Sikh. But this is the story. Few years later, our Rebbe goes on this mamash rampage. How you talking kids are learning limudei chol, and on and on and on. Right? And the Rebbe made all the Teda. Then it was called Oli Teda, and that was called Oli Menachem Mendel. The Rebbe's yeshiva. 54, 55. Toshin, I think Toshin Tezvav or Tezayin. 54 or 55. The Teretz is, when the Friedrich Rebbe started, if he didn't have limudei chol, he wouldn't have had students. Pashkim Shutter. The Rebbe, the moment it was possible to have yeshiva, Taras HaKedesh, he launched it. He told Reb Michal, title B'Malav Shalom, B'Vedboyin the yeshiva Medayin Mesiras Nefesh and Mein Geld. We're going to build the yeshiva with your hard work and my money. And in the first couple of years, every month, Reb Michal would come to the Rebbe with what he was missing, and the Rebbe would give him a check to pay his teachers. That's went on for a few years. When Reb Nissen was here once, Reb Nissen Nemanov was here, Reb Michal Tarabam said to Reb Nissen, you always know that a Rebbe you give. I'm taking from the Rebbe, have you chodesh geld? Doesn't make sense. So Reb Nissen told him that, ain't it? The Rebbe didn't say that the money has to come out of his checkbook. It's his money. He can find another way. So the Rebbe made a shutfus between Reb Michal and Reb David Deitch. And that's how it around for 30 years. A budget. Basically, one family paid the bills. It was the Rebbe's geld. It was the Rebbe's geld. Michal's Mesiras Nefesh and the Rebbe's geld. So the Rabbeim always took the high road. Not the high road, the lazy road. The principal road. And if everybody's doing it and you're doing it too, but to stand on principle, this is a Rebbe. This is what the Friedrich Rebbe's father told him on his 15th birthday. When he said, this way you know one way. When you know that you want to do something for Torah and Yiddishkeit, and Yidden, and Al Pi Torah, it has to be done in this way. But this is inconvenient and it's hard and there are greater challenges and there's a possibility that you'll fail. As Zoyin it Andish means your own but from principle. This is the koyach of a Rebbe. It really is the koyach of a Rebbe. If a chassid has that koyach, he draws that koyach. The Rebbe told the tilt by Fabrengen. In a few days from now, I don't know exactly the date, is Reb Shmuel's yahrzeit. Reb Shmuel Levittin passed away in 1974. That means almost 50 years ago. 1974. Yeah, now we're holding 2020. So he passed, I think his yahrzeit is Yud Beis Yud Gimel Elul. Chai Elul was a Fabrengen. A weekday Fabrengen, there's a tape. And in the Fabrengen, the Rebbe mentioned his name, Reb Shmuel Levittin. Reb Shmuel Levittin. And he said, the Rebbe said that Reb Shmuel Levittin told him a story. The Rebbe said, about himself. What was the story? The story was that he was in Siberia for 3 years. You know, it's not funny. All the Lubavitcher Chassidim sat in jail at least once. They used to say, einmal is a chiyuv, zweimal is hidden mitzvah, dreimal is mechet yiyur. Once is an obligation, the second time is being from, 3 times is being boastful. But you have to understand, when they sent away people in the 20s, all of the Lubavitchers sat in jail in the 20s. All of them. For 3, you can't sit here. You can sit here. You can sit here. You can't sit in front. You can sit over here. Yeah. All of the Lubavitchers sat in jail. All of them. But they came back. Reb Nissen and Reb Benzi and Shemtiv. All of them. By the time the 30s came, that's when Stalin Pasha started shooting people. In the beginning, you were teaching Kindle they sent you away for 3 years. There was some normalcy. So that's why it became, you couldn't afford to go to Siberia, you didn't come back. But the first round, most of the Anash came back. Reb Shmuel was older. Reb Shmuel was in Siberia for 3 years in the 1920s. Then he came back and he started the what was it called? They had a yeshiva for Bacharim who were out of yeshiva. I forgot what they called. They called it Bachurim, Teferes Bachurim they called it in Neville. And Reb Shmuel was the head of that yeshiva, on and on and on and on. Anyway, Reb Shmuel was in Siberia for 3 years. He didn't have tefillin, he didn't have a siddur, he didn't have a chumash, he had nothing. So he davened by heart. And he forgot one of the brachas. If you say Anesen la yo'if keach or Anesen la oyif keach. You say Anesen la yo'if keach. It's one of the brachas anyway. I don't remember Reb Shmuel. I really don't. My younger brother, Gezunzan, remembers. He has a clearer head than me. Ich gedenk nicht. Reb Shmuel passed away when I was 9, almost 9. But people describe to me Reb Shmuel's bracha, a shahakal but vori, took 60 seconds. Every one. A bracha by Reb Shmuel was an Indian. Every time he made a bracha, he thought about the Eibishter. And Ashayotza was a geschäft for 5 minutes. He was very ehrlich. He was a Chatchila Yid. He was a Godel. He was a Gon in England and Isted. He was a Rav. He was a big chassid. A very, very big chassid. And he forgot what you're supposed to say, Anesim la Yoev Ker, Anesim la Yoev Ker. So the Rebbe says, he told me the story. When he told me the story, there was nobody around but me. Which means it wasn't boastful. He wasn't saying it to get points. No one is going to know. It was a private story that he shared with me. He told it to me because the story was so meaningful to him, as that 30 years after it happened, he was still thinking about it. So the Rebbe says, a man goes to Siberia. He's away from his family. He doesn't know what's going on with his family. He can't support them. He can't look after them. They're Nebuch, Almonis, and Yesemim Chayim. He himself, he goes out to work 6 days a week, from morning till night, schlepping echveis was, considered hatanish, katfilin hatanish. And 30 years later, what does he remember from that time? How you say a bracha. And the Rebbe said rhetorically almost, how can a person care so much about a bracha under those conditions that 30 years later, this is what he should remember? The Rebbe says the teretz is because it was what mattered to him. Because it was mattered to him. How could this matter to him, the Rebbe said? It's the koyach that he had from the Rebbe. That's what the Rebbe said. A person by himself, even a big person, under those conditions, would not remember 30 years ago that this was on his mind. Because there were so many other things on his mind. The Rebbe gave a koyach to a Yid that he should possibly be more Yid than he was by himself. You understand? More Yid than he was by himself. And this is, we're going back to the point. The Rabbeim wanted Moistes Torah v'chinuch lechatchila. Lechatchila, no pshara. And today it's easier, and we're having a harder time. You know, we're having a harder time because we're melting. We're becoming American. When the Rabbeim were pushing us, and they were literally holding us by the hand, they gave us a koyach from Mesiras Nefesh at a time that it was much harder. Chinuch Torah had 3 kids. All of Anash sent their children to learn the Lubavitch Yeshiva. And they were worried about education and parnasa. They were becoming Americans, and in America there was a certain presumption of how you have to be a mensch, and the Rabbeim wanted to change that. That the presumption, you want to be a mensch, you have to be a Yid. Finished. Everything else works itself out on that foundation. So the Rebbe is talking about Chinuch al Taras HaKodesh, which is an expression in Chazal. Taras HaKodesh is an expression in Chazal that has a lot of applications. To make a long story short, there's 5 levels, okay? There's Chulin, there's Ma'aseh Sheni, there's Truma, there's Karbonis, Kachim. Truma is called Tahares, there's Karbonis, which are Kachim, and then you have Efer Paradum. The halacha is, if a person falls into the mikveh by mistake, you fall into a mikveh, you're tahir for Chulin. You're tahir for certain things. But if you want to go to the mikveh to eat a korban, if you didn't have in mind when you toivel that you're going to tahara for a korban, you have to toivel again. If you had in mind that you're going to the mikveh to eat teruma, and then you want to eat a korban, you got to mikveh again, because the kavanah of mikveh changes the mikveh. It's exactly the same act. There's certain things that you become tahir without kavanah, but for higher standards, you have to push it. You have to have a tefillah with the right kavanah. If you toivel with the wrong kavanah, if you toivel to eat karbonis or kachim kalam, kachim kadishim, and then you're doing paras chatas, paradum, you got to go back to the mikveh. There's a different levels. So this called chulin al taras hakodesh, that you eat regular food with the tar of kedusha, and then there's ma'aseh sheni, which is not allowed to become tamei, and there is truma, which is not allowed to become tamei. There's karbonis, kachim kadishim, and so on. There's different madregi. So the expression taras hakodesh is used behaviorally. It's not just a philosophical or a spiritual expression. It's a halachic term. That in the time of the second Beis HaMikdash, there was a problem with Dmai. Dmai meant that people were not careful about whatever it is, Ma'aser Rishon, and the Ikir is the Trumas Ma'aser. So they became a status which is called Chavrus. Chaverim. Chavrus. Chavrus was almost like a club. It was a membership, a club that you had to belong to. Chaverim were Talmidei Chachamim, and of course you know the halacha. Eishes chaver kechaver. The wife of a chaver is assumed to be a chaver. This is a halacha. It's not just a psachsidische word. It's a din in Dmai. And if you were a chaver, so you were trusted. In the time of the Beis HaMikdash, you gave a person a piece of food. Did you take all the matanis? Did you take Truma? Did you take Bikurim? Did you take Truma? Did you take Meiser Rishon? Did you take Trumas Meiser? Did you take Meiser Sheni? Meiser Roni? Peyah? All the different things that you have to do. Peyah, Leket, Shikha, all of Chayov. If you didn't do all of those things, for some of them, there was mamish, it could be terrible. It's a misa b'dei shamayim. So they didn't trust non-chaverim. If you were non-chaver, if a non-chaver gave you wheat, you would assume that he didn't take Trumas Meiser, and you would take a certain portion, and you would give it away to the kohen. You would be the halachas of D'mai. D'mai means you're not sure if this person is reliable, even though we know most people, even the Amaratzim, were careful, but this was another hidur mitzvah that the chaverim took on, is that even chulin al taras hakedesh. You're a Yisrael, you're not a kohen. And you're eating regular bread, it's not truma, it's not meiser, it's not meiser sheni, it's not bikurim, it's not korbanos, it's chulin. Chulin al taras hakedesh, that even when they were eating a regular piece of bread, they would be tired from mikveh and whatever else they needed, to eat this bread al taras hakedesh. It was pure enough they could use for a korban. It was a chumrah that people took on. Now this is very complicated and it's very, very hard. It's not easy to do. People will come tell me by mistake. People come tell me all the time. You touch the wrong surface, you have to go to the mikveh. No, you go to the mikveh, you have to wait till nightfall to eat, so you can eat now. Depending on the nature of the tumah. Wait till tomorrow morning and so on. But this was a standard that chaverim took on. So the term taras hakodesh was used halachically. It was used in life. It wasn't just a nice Fabrengen term, the way we use it, because today we're all Tmei Mes, we're all Tamei. Right? The only thing we worry about, the only tumas we worry about is Netilas Yadayim. If you're going to eat bread, not cake, and not fruit, if you're going to eat bread, so they made a Shlomo Melech made a gzeira that we should do Netilas Yadayim, and we make a bracha on it, because of a gzeira, don't ask a gzeira on top of a gzeira about Trum. But otherwise, we don't concern ourselves with Tumah in Zman HaGolus. In Eretz Yisrael, they have the need to separate matonis, but they don't worry about tum and tara. They just worry about separating the matonis. In other words, you have to take out a portion that corresponds to the truma, and you have to destroy it. Otherwise, it becomes a shayla of nisimisi b'dei shamayim. Anyway, so what's left for us from this halachic tradition of being mahader and machmir, that the chulin should be al taras hakodesh, that even your ordinary things should be done on a level of purity and holiness, or the purity of holiness, is the philosophy, is in the head. That when we live our lives, and we raise our children, it's al taras hakodesh. Is it required? No, it's not required. It's a hidden mitzvah. It's doing things the best way. In Lashon HaChasidus, lechatchila. Not looking to cut corners. When you buy a car, you want the best. When you mechanech a child, you want the best. The best in terms of Yiddishkeit, in terms of Emunah, and Kedusha, and Tahara, and all these things. So this is the tradition. It's called Chinuch al Taras HaKodesh. So the Rebbe is talking to this chassid, Rebbe Asher Abramson, about the concept of Taras HaKodesh as an excuse, you understand? He had a pretense. He wrote him about a yeshiva, and I've already gotten to 11:30, which makes me right on time. Yeah, the class is about to finish. We're ready to start reading. Let's read it. I'm sorry, go ahead. As a korban. No, that the food should be like a korban. So you're eating bread. These are very complicated halachas, which is chulin. And chulin cannot become tameh beyond the sheni anyway. But you go to the mikveh, and you're mechaver, you tell me to the mikveh that I felt it karbonis. So that the bread that you eat chulin, and you're a Yisrael, you're not even a kohen. There's no prohibition for Yisrael to be tameh except per regel. A kohen is not allowed to become tameh ever. It was a lifestyle. It was almost like Naziris. But it wasn't for Shloshim Yom. It was a lifestyle called Chavros. Again, the beginning of that was the Shaila of Demai. It was a practical question. And then the Chaverim took on different customs. And one of the customs was that they were careful about eating Chulin al Taras HaKodesh. The food they ate was good enough to be eaten by a kohen in the Beis HaMikdash. In their living room in Golil, or in Eved HaYarden, or in the Dorim. You understand? Taras HaKodesh.
Yeah, I understand.
Pure enough to be in the madreg of holiness.
So trying to raise as holy children as we can. As they can be. The children should be as holy as it can be.
That's the spirit of it. The choice of words is hard. So I'm reading inside, if I may, yes? There's enough papers. I know it's still have enough copies. I haven't yet exhausted my supply. Geidel ha'inyan, the greatness of this notion of Yesod, of founding, v'hispatchus, and developing, yeshiva al taras HaKodesh. The fact that children are going to learn Siddur and Chumash and Mishnah is already a huge thing. But it's not enough. You want the highest standards. So the Rebbe says, Asher. There's Kedusha and there's Tahara. There's holiness and there's purity. To eat Truma, you have to be pure. To eat a korban, you can't say you have to be holy. You can't be holy. You're involved in holiness. The mikveh is mitaher you. The mikveh makes you pure. There's a mikveh which makes you holy, by the way. You know what it's called? The Gemara talks about it. I remember the Rebbe speaking about it. Iker tvilusa benura. You speak Aramaic. Iker, the primary mikveh is fire. No. How can you table in fire? It's a ma'ameh chazal. Iker tvilusa benura. I don't know if it's a Zayr or it's a Gemara. Nobody, you can't table in fire, you table in water. Tabling in water purifies. Tabling in fire, I mean, you know where it applies. If you have a klicheres, an earthenware vessel, and the halachas by an earthenware vessel is that it becomes tameh, there's no tahara. You cannot be metar earthenware vessel except for one way. You put it back in the furnace. Machazina lekifsha. Fire. So you're making a new keli. When you take an old earthenware vessel and you put it back into that kiln, you heat it up to 1200 degrees, so now it's a new keli. That's mitayed, the klicheres, because it's not the same keli, it's fire. But nobody toivels in fire, you understand? There's a story with the Frierdiker Rebbe, he says himself, that he read this, which I was a child, the Frierdiker Rebbe said, and I read in a sefer that for a certain Aveda, the tikkun is to put your hands in boiling water. Frierdiker Rebbe was a child. So he says, I went over to the Samavar, they had a chainik, but not like our Chineks that are 180 degrees. It was boiling, and I put my hands on. It was going to burn my hands. The Rebbe Rashab, my father saw this. He ran over and he grabbed me, and he was very upset. He asked me, "What are you doing?" So I told him what I'm doing. He says, "You never do such things without asking." He didn't tell him not to, but this is the Iker Tfilusa Benura. Zudike Wasser, kipshute, boiling water, not hot water, boiling water, kipshute. That was a child, nishka chachmis, nishka, whatever that means. There's another story which I don't have time to tell you right now. But you go to the mikveh, that's tahara. But you're going to the mikveh to make yourself a keli for kedusha. So the Rebbe says that in Nigle, karbanes are higher than truma. Karbanes are called kachim, and truma is called taharos. Right? Karbanes is a higher standard. Trumas is a lower standard. The way this is separated in hint is this. Asha Truma Zel Mabriya. Truma is the world of Briya. And the Kadesh is Atzilus. It says in the Zayah that Kadesh is Mila Bagameh. It's by itself. Which goes on the world of Atzilus. The word Kadesh is not connected to anything. It's a noun. It's a noun. It's an entity, the entity of holiness. That's the teaching of the words. Kodesh mili begamei. There's Kodesh and there's Kodosh. Anshe Kodesh. Over there they take a Kodesh. No. Kodosh. Kodesh can be connected to something else, but Kodosh, without a vav, kuv dalet shin, is the noun of holiness. It's by itself. It's not connected to any other thing, and it's the madreg of Elam Atzilis. You have Shabbos Kodesh, but you don't have Shabbos Kodesh. Kodesh is a thing unto itself. Shalachein gam keneviyu rak b'kodesh. The halachas are that for Chulin you can have a Rishon l'tumah and a Sheni l'tumah. For Ma'aseh Sheni you can have a Sheni l'tumah. For Teruma you can have a Shlishi l'tumah. For Karbanis you can have a Revi l'tumah. It means that the tumah is because the thing is holier. It'll carry a tumah that's lower and lower and lower. There's a lot of gezedas that are abonan about truma, about tumah, and one of them is that a korban can be a fourth. If a person touches a dead body, that person is called an avatuma. If he touches a keli, that keli becomes a rishon l'tumah. If that keli touches food, that food becomes a sheni l'tumah. That's where it should stop. If that food is going to then touch another food, it's not going to become a shlishi. If it touches water, though, you have to ask it off. But if that other food is truma, it becomes a shlishi. And if that truma touches a carbon, the carbon becomes a revi. They added extra tumas. Truma you can have shlishi but not revi. And karbanas you can have a revi and not a chamishi. A paraduma has a chamishi, but not a chamishi. A paraduma, 1,000 tumas, one after the next, is still matama paraduma. There's no such thing as the tumas subsiding because it's been diminished when it comes to paraduma. And it's called the chamishi. But for a carbon, a revi is also matama. And the part of Torah that's associated with the idea of holiness is chelek haseich of Torah, is Kabbalah. Ukidu, as we know, asher pardes the Torah. When you talk about the four levels of Pshat, Remes, Drush, and Say, the secret, the garden of Torah, say the Kabbalah, the secret of the Torah, and the Kabbalah, in other words, things that you can't figure out by yourself, they have to be given over ish mipiyish from Eliyahu and Navi, is Be'elam Atzilas. So the Rebbe says, making a yeshiva, al Taras HaKodesh, is a korban. Making the yeshiva al Taras HaKodesh in Melbourne, Australia, in 1951, is Atzilus. Is Atzilus. I told you this. There's a Yid named Shmuel Gerevish, who was angesund and stark. The Menachem Zalman's son. I met him. I talked. He's a very geschmack, interesting man. He wrote a book called Mr. G. Not Rabbi G, Mr. G. This is him. With all of his miles, all of his Mishigassen, but he was a mechanech for decades. The Rebbe gave him the Beis Rivka. The Rebbe told him the Beis Rivka. And he moved back to, he was living in Israel. He married a non-Lubavitch girl because he couldn't find a girl who wanted to marry someone with a boy. You understand? A non-Lubavitch girl, but she was an Israeli. So he moved to live where she was. Then he moved back to Australia, and she's Ol Gezunzai moved with him, and they've been living there now for 50 years. And for many, many years he ran the Beis Rivka. They wish they could have him back. Trust me, they wish they could have him back. Anyway, he writes, I forgot what I wanted to say.
What's her name again?
Grevich. The Rebbe told his father, Reb Nachum Zalman, he says, if being involved in spreading Yiddishkeit in other places is pikuach nefesh, in Australia it's tchias hamesim mamish. That's what the Rebbe said. To be involved in chinuch, and this is 1970, not 1950. 1950 is alachas kamavakama. To get involved in askonos tiburis and doing the Rebbe's work in Australia is tchias hamesim. To make Taras HaKodesh in Australia, you understand what that means? The hardships. To bring Atzilus to a place of Tchias HaMesim. Tchias HaMesim means at first you have Mesim without Tchiyah, and then they have to become in the Tchiyah. You understand? So the Rebbe is trying to bring out how extraordinary it is, how difficult it is, and how important it is, and how worthwhile it is to make such a Moishet Chinuch. And the Rebbe says, in other words, Chinuch Taras HaKodesh is connected to holiness, to the world of Atzilus. Okay, I'm going to stop. I didn't teach you anything. I talked a lot. We read little. But it was a good class, I think. Okay, so I will see you in Mitzvah Hashem.
Rabbi Paltiel, everybody here. Tonight, I believe, Ariella, it's Roswell. I'm going to show the sword side tonight, first sword side. I think we should do something.
Why don't you go over to Ariella and talk to her?
Because Ariella doesn't want to talk to me.
Oh, I see. So